Well, I want you to take your Bibles or your apps or whatever you read on, and I want you to turn to the book of 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6. Now, if you don't have a Bible with you, we've got Bibles in the chairs around you. Grab one of those. Go to the table of contents, because if I try and describe where 1 Timothy's at, I'm just going to make you more lost. That's why God gave us the table of contents, by the way. Go to that table of contents. You're going to look for the New Testament. 1 Timothy is in the New Testament, and you want to turn to 1 Timothy chapter 6. Now, if you don't have a Bible at home, please, at the end of the service, take that Bible that's in the chair next to you, pick it up, and walk out the door with it. We want everybody to have a Bible in their home that they can read and study and reference. So please, let that be our gift to you this morning. Now, as you're turning to 1 Timothy chapter 6, let me tell you a little story about my early days of seminary. I started seminary back in 2005, way back in the day. Yeah, I'm a little old. I'm not that old to some of you, but to some of you, I'm really old. Anyways, I started seminary, and I very quickly realized that I was going to need a laptop, because everything that you do in school now is submitted online. You access your notes, you access tests, you access questions to the professors, and you submit papers through digital means nowadays. And so I realized pretty early on that I was going to need a laptop. And so my father-in-law, in his generosity, gave me an old laptop that he had that still functioned really well. It was a Compaq. Does anybody remember Compaq computers? That's how old this thing is. Like, it was archaic. It was about the size of a typical laptop, except that it was about that thick. It was like 3 inches tall when I would set it down on a desk. It was bigger than some of my textbooks for seminary. I mean, this thing was a mammoth. So I would show up to seminary, and I would open up this big laptop, and I'd take notes and do papers and all that stuff. Well, a few weeks into seminary, suddenly the screen started glitching on me. Like, it would stop working and then come back on, it'd stop working, come back on. Well, if you've used a computer, you know that a screen is basically pretty essential to the function of using a computer, right? You can't use a laptop or a desktop without something to view on. So I had to figure out how to fix this thing. So I took that computer home one day, I sat down at my kitchen table, and I took it apart. And I pulled the faceplate off of the screen and found the problem. The connector from the main part of the laptop to the screen had it was pinched and had like a short in it. And the only way to correct it was to leave the faceplate off of my laptop, and when the screen would go out, I would just tap that little that connector, and it would pop back on. And so I would go to seminary, kid you not, with a Compaq computer that was 3 inches tall, and I would open that thing up, and it was just an open faceplate with all these wires and everything, and the people behind me in my classes would start laughing at me because I had this like Frankenstein laptop computer. Now, it functioned, it worked, but it was not pretty. Now, fast forward a few months, I was invited to go teach at a weekend teenager retreat. And so I get to this weekend retreat, we have the first night of worship, and I took my high school boys that I was teaching that weekend, and we went to the house that we were going to stay at all weekend. Now, the owner of this house owned one of the largest motorcycle dealerships in all of Fort Worth, Texas. Needless to say, the guy had some money. So go in, we settle in, we have our Bible study for the evening. I send the guys to bed. They go to bed. Well, I had a paper I was working on, so I stayed up really, really late that first night, typing away on this Frankenstein, big, huge laptop. And at one point during the evening, the host's wife walked through and was like, "Is that your computer?" And I was like, "Yeah, what if..." No, I didn't say that. But I was like, "Yeah, it's got this glitch, so I found out a way to fix it, blah, blah, blah." Fast forward now, another few weeks. The guy who owned the house, the guy who hosted us that weekend, calls me up and says, "Hey, Chad, I had a really good time with you as our Bible study leader. How about you meet me for lunch one day? And I was like, yeah, great, free lunch, woohoo. So meet him for lunch. He walks in carrying this big grocery bag and sets it down, and we sit down. We're talking about this and that, about the weekend and Bible study, and he was going to go on a big mission trip, so we talked about that for a little bit. And then towards the end of the meal, he said, listen, I can't in good conscience let you keep using that terrible, cruddy laptop that you have. And I was like, okay. And he pulls out a really nice Hewlett-Packard laptop. And he said, we've been looking for an excuse to buy a new laptop, so here you go. And he gave me this really nice laptop. That laptop lasted me all through seminary and into the first couple of years of my first ministry out of seminary. Now, why am I telling you this story? That guy's generosity changed my life. Let's be honest for a minute. That compact was not going to last much longer, was it? His generosity physically gave me the ability to do my schoolwork in seminary. And it would have been hard for me to get through seminary without a good functioning laptop. So today, I want to focus on how we serve God and others in the church and our community through our generosity. And so, before we go any further, let me do a little backtracking. Let's look at where we've been, because we've been doing that every single Sunday. We're on a series called The Unique Us. What makes First Southern different from the church up the street? Because every church is unique. Every church is different. How are we unique? Well, we define that by first off defining what our mission statement is. And our mission statement is leading every generation to the life-changing hope of Jesus. And then we went into talking about how that mission statement is accomplished and defined by our 4 values. Now, those 4 values, the first one is believe. And there's a tagline with every single one of the values. The tagline for believe is God's truth. Let me make sure I say this right. God's truth is the foundation to knowing, loving, and understanding Him. And then the second value is grow. And the tagline on that is growth means change. And following God is moving where He takes us both personally and as a church. And we did a couple sermons just on grow and what that looks like. Then the third value is connect. And the tagline to connect is hope is proclaimed when we are in relationship with God, the church family, and our community. And we talked about how we connect to God and our community and others through worship. And how worship is more than just singing, it's our entire lifestyle, according to Romans 12. And we talked about prayer being a major way, probably the primary way that we connect to God. And it's through prayer that we have the ability to connect across the board with everyone else. And then last week, we introduced the concept of serve being our 4th core value. And serve's tagline is this: we are committed to selflessly serving God and others in the church, community, and world. The idea being is that we were made to serve others. So last week I talked about serving His church and how we're all designed to do something unique and special for His church body. And so that's what we talked about last week. And this week I want to talk about how we serve others through our generosity. So before we go any further, what is generosity? What do I mean when I throw that word around? Well, generosity is simply how we give to others. And I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about resources. I'm talking about time. I'm talking about kindness and love and peace. Anytime that we give something that we have, whether it's tangible or intangible, when we give to someone else, we are being generous. But God gives us a baseline of what we're called to give. Generosity is when we go above and beyond that baseline. It's when we go above and beyond to show others the life-changing hope of Jesus. So, let's take our Bibles and turn to 1 Timothy 6. 1 through 19. So 1 Timothy chapter 6, starting in verse 17. And it says this: as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasures for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. Now, this is Paul talking to Timothy. And Paul has a lot to say about generosity. If you go and read Galatians, for example, Galatians 5 and 6 both have a lot to say about how to be and why to be a generous people. But in this passage, he's specifically talking to Timothy, who was a young pastor. Now, let's begin and let's kind of break this down verse by verse. So look with me again at verse 17. As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. Now, you may hear this verse and go, yeah, but I'm not rich. Actually, yes, you are. So let me explain what I mean by that. If you were to take the poorest person in the United States, they still have more money and resources than 80% of the worldwide population. You realize that there's 80% of the population that literally lives on less than $5 a day. That is way more than what even the poorest person in the United States, through the resources that the United States provides, that is way more than what we have as the poorest person has way more than what 80% of the population of the world has. So technically, as Americans, no matter what your socioeconomic status is or how much money you bring in a given year, as Americans, we are wealthier than 80% of the rest of the world's population. So you look at this passage and go, well, I'm not rich. Maybe compared to your American neighbor, you're not. But compared to the people of the world, you are vastly wealthy. You have so much more than the vast majority of the rest of the people that live on this planet. So yes, you are rich. So how do we look at what he's saying in light of our given circumstances, our setting? Well, what does he say in verse 17? He says, first off, don't be haughty, don't be proud and all that stuff about your wealth, but instead do not place your faith on the uncertainty of money. Let's be honest, everyone in this room probably has a pretty good idea of how uncertain money can be. You can lose a job. The economy can hit a recession. You may have a car breakdown and have to pay tons of money, and suddenly you don't have money in your bank account. There are so many things that play into the uncertainty of dependence on money. But where does God say to put our dependence? At the end of verse 17, he says to place our faith, our dependency on him and what he gives eternally. Guys, think about this for a second. Your life on this earth compared to your eternal existence in heaven, your life on this earth is like a speck of sand compared to all the sand on the face of the planet. Your life on this earth is nothing in perspective to eternity, forever and ever. And so we look at this and we are called to live our lives dependent on that which is eternal. Guys, Jesus will never let you down. No matter how poor you are, no matter how life gets you down, no matter how difficult things are financially, you will always have your salvation in Jesus. If you lost everything, you would still have Jesus. And that doesn't sound very hopeful in a physical sense, but the physical is so temporary. Jesus is eternal, forever and ever and ever. So we place our trust in God. Now look at verse 18 with me. He says, they are to do good, to be rich in good works, and to be generous and ready to share. We're supposed to be generous with what we have. Let me teach you a little spiritual truth here. You get what you give. You get what you give. And let me be very clear here. I'm not talking about what is called a prosperity gospel. I don't believe in that. It's unbiblical. It's completely contrary to God's word. What I'm talking about here is what Galatians 6 tells us. We will reap what we sow. The fact of the matter is God may never bless you with a lot of money. God may never bless you with the nice car or the big house. He will always provide your basic needs unless he's bringing you to heaven. But the fact is Paul says we're supposed to depend on what he provides. And when Paul in Galatians 6 talks about reaping what we sow, he's talking about spiritual truth. Let's be honest for a second. If you know anything about the life of Paul, who wrote the book of Galatians and wrote 1 Timothy, Paul was never accused of being wealthy. When he started his journey with Jesus as a follower of Christ, he gave up all of his possessions. And he lived on the barest of means. Sometimes he was in prison and lived a pretty rough life. Jail and prison was not like what it is today, where you have a comfortable air-conditioned cell and TV and 3 square meals. Prison and jail back then, people died from just living in those prisons. Paul's not saying that if you give, you're going to be financially blessed. Paul is saying when you give, God will spiritually bless you. Paul's reward was not physical. Paul's reward was spiritual. He got to see churches that he planted grow and lead others to Jesus. And let's be honest, not any of us in this room can claim that we're greater spiritually than Paul. Paul was a mammoth of a man spiritually. He was powerful spiritually. That's what he reaped. He reaped those spiritual blessings. And that's what God is talking about here in verse 18. We need to live generously. We need to be willing to share and to give and to be generous and to help others. Because let's be honest again, when we give to others, that is such a beacon of light to those who don't know Jesus, isn't it? Sometimes it's what someone who knows Jesus desperately needs in that moment. And so Paul calls us to give. But here's the thing, if you give the minimum, you will get the minimum back. Spiritually, physically, financially, whatever. If you're going to be stingy, you will be given sparingly. God's not going to reward you for not being a cheerful giver. The idea is that we should not give out of compulsion or give and go, oh, I hate doing this. We give with a joyous, cheerful spirit, knowing that our generosity will reap spiritual benefits, that people will know Christ or will grow in Christ because of our generosity. So, now let's look at verse 19. Verse 19, he says, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. You see, we're called to store up wealth in heaven for eternity, not so much here. Now, there's nothing wrong with having money, and there's nothing wrong with making sure that you leave something for your kids and your grandkids, etc. What he's talking about here is if you're more focused on providing wealth here and you're not focused on your eternal wealth, you're missing the point. If you're pouring money into the lives of your children and your children are spiritually dead because you're not pouring into them spiritually, you're missing the point of the life of this earth. You're missing the point of why God created you and gave you children and grandchildren to begin with. You see, Paul has a greater purpose. Look at the way he ends verse 19. He makes an interesting statement. He says, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. What does he mean by that? What does he mean, taking hold of that which is truly life? You see, if you want everything out of this life, if you want to live life to the fullest in the fullest purpose. Your purpose will never, ever be fulfilled unless you live in generosity. Generosity is the key to having a full and fulfilled purpose, mattering life. Your life and the impact it has and the way you squeeze everything out of life before God takes you is dependent on your generosity. It's dependent on how generous you are. Now, how does Jesus want us to be generous? Well, first off, the most obvious way that everyone thinks of when we have this conversation is with our money, with the things we have. And guys, we can't not talk about this. God gave us resources for a purpose. And if you're holding on and you're burying those resources just for you, or that money just for you, and you're not sharing it and blessing others who are in need around you, you're missing the point of what God gave you those resources for. The fact is, as Jesus told us, if you have a brother who's in need and you don't provide that need, you're missing my will. James defines sin as knowing the good that you should do and not doing it. If you have the means to provide for someone less fortunate than you and you don't provide that, according to James, is your struggle, your sin, the thing that you are doing that makes you fall short from God's glory. That's why God gave you money and resources. But listen, I don't want this to be about money. That's a different sermon, to be totally honest. Because generosity does not just mean money. Generosity means so much more. So how else does God want us to be generous? I'm going to give you two more things. And there are dozens, but I think these two things kind of are the big umbrella ways that we can be generous. The second way, outside of money, that we can be generous is being generous with the fruit of the Spirit. In Galatians 5, what's the instruction given to us? We're supposed to be, we love, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. We're supposed to live that kind of life. I messed the order up on that, by the way. But if you are generous with love, if you are generous with peace, if you're generous with patience and kindness, people are going to notice that, right? Because we live in a day and age where peace and kindness and real love is hard to find. It's rare. And so when you show the people around you love, and when you're joyous and you are generous with your joy, and you are peaceful, and that peace is generous, it just exudes from you. And when you're patient with people, and you're kind with people, and you're good, and all the others, when you live that kind of life, people will reap, they'll take, they'll want it, they desire those kinds of things because they can't find them in our society today. So be generous with the fruit of the Spirit. And the third way outside of money and the fruit of the Spirit that we can be generous is we can be generous with our time. It's so hard today to find people who will sacrifice time to help another. It's rare, especially in today's culture. Guys, you can all probably agree with me, in today's culture, there's kind of this demand to fill every waking hour of every single day, right? You get up in the morning, I got to get ready, and then I got to go to work, and I'm going to work all day, and when I get home, I've got to do this and this and this and this and this. And I got to take the kids to this, and my wife's going to take the other kid to this, and then we got to do this. And when we get home at 9 o'clock, we got to make sure that the kids do this, and then we got to get them in bed. And then I'm done because I'm exhausted, and I got nothing left to give. Where was God? Where was others? We have to be generous with our time. We have to be intentional, and I've talked about this extensively over the last several weeks. We have to be intentional with giving God some of our time. I put a reminder in my phone that goes off that reminds me to etch out time in my day to spend time with Him. Maybe you need to do the same. Maybe you need to schedule your time. Maybe you need to have a time slot on your calendar that says time with God. And you intentionally use that time to study His Word, to pray, to worship, whatever that looks like in your life. But we also need to etch time out in our life for others. And we need to have the flexibility in our schedule to help others when the need arises. I can't tell you how many times I've been in need of someone to step in and help in a situation, and someone has stepped up and helped me. And I can remember almost every single one of those instances because it's rare and it impacted my life. So, here's a question that I want us to think about. Are you looking to justify giving less, or are you looking for opportunities to give more? God gives us a minimum, but He never intended us to live by a minimum. He intended us to live generously above and beyond the minimum. How can you give your money, your resources, your time, the fruit of the Spirit? How can you go above and beyond to blow this community up for Jesus? Because people will notice if you're generous. I see it. If you are generous with your resources, if you are generous with the fruit of the Spirit, if you are generous with your time, people will notice and they will desperately want what you have. So are you looking to make excuses to give less? Or are you looking for opportunities to give more to God and others? Will you join me in prayer?